Okay, yeah, we might need the 7 hours. Okay. So the fact that Adam comes first within the Genesis narrative means that he is more primitive, because we go from very simple things in Genesis to much more complex things. And in terms of Adam, we go from dust to man to woman. And if Adam is the head of creation, Eve is the crown. And so I think if you just follow literarily what is going on in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't get the sense of Eve being a lesser, but actually a more developed creature than Adam is. And the fact that she is the helper, the Ezer, is that, God is most commonly spoken of as our help, in that we cannot live without him. We need help. We desperately need help. And so the helper does not mean it's a diminutive role at all, I would say.
As to Adam and Eve, though, I've got to say, I don't think the logic works. I love the idea that Eve is the pinnacle, that God saved the best for last. That's great. But if you follow that logic, what you're saying is, first God creates the other animals to help Adam. And if he's more primitive than Eve because he was first, that means he's more primitive than the animals, which means that spiders and snakes and aardvarks are superior to humans in that scheme.
The animals are already there. He just hadn't named them.
No, God made them in order to help him. That's why he made.
God brought the animals to him, but the animals are created.
The animals are created. At least in the first chapter of Genesis, the animals get created on whatever is day 4 or 5.
I'm not talking about the first. As you know, look, this is another long issue. But Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from two different stories. Eve does not show up in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2, and the reason Glen is presupposing Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, when he says that Eve came second. So I'm talking about what he's talking about, Eve coming second. She doesn't come second, she comes after the animals. And so if she's superior to Adam because she was made as his helper, the animals are made as his helpers.
They're not made. They were brought to him. They were brought to him. They weren't made. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. That God makes the animals in order to help Adam. He names them, but they're only after they're made. Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that difference there. Obviously, I suppose to some extent depends on the way you read that chapter 2 of Genesis. But let's keep talking. I want to hit some of these other issues as well.
I'll just say, Genesis 2:19 says that God brought the animals out of the ground in order to help Adam. It's that 2:19. Just read it.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one. What about compassion?
Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and the birds in the sky.
What translation are you reading?
And he brought them. This is NIV.
Yeah, right. There's no pluperfect tense in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to leave that one for the biblical scholars to debate. Talk about consent as well, Glen, because this is something that has been obviously in our news feeds a lot in recent years, the Me Too movement and so on, the idea that a pushback against power dynamics where essentially people cannot make informed consent is obviously another buzzword that's been going around recently. Why do you believe that this particular idea has its roots in the Christian story? And then we'll pass it to Bart.
I think Kyle Harper is a wonderful writer and a historian, written very compellingly on slavery and on just recently on plagues. But his book From Shame to Sin on sort of the sexual revolution of late antiquity was a real eye-opener for me, because when I hear the phrase sexual revolution, I think of the 1960s. And again, I think of a time when, because of contraception and other social movements, women are able to be as liberated as men had always been in the sexual domain and attained that sort of equality in that sort of way. And what he pointed out, and also what Joseph Henrich has pointed out, I think in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, is that Joseph Henrich uses a very visceral phrase. He says, the church reached down and grabbed men by the testicles. And what he really meant is here is Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 saying, it's one man, one woman for life. You're not getting out of it. And your only other option is be a eunuch for the kingdom. it's an incredible, such that, red-blooded Peter, one of Jesus' followers, says, if this is the way it is, it'd be better not to be married. And like, we are not told what Mrs. Peter thought of Peter saying that, because he was a married guy, saying that it would be better not to be married if Jesus' marriage and family program is true. And yet, I am persuaded, and I'm persuaded through books like Joseph Henrich's The Weirdest People in the World, that kind of radical monogamy was incredibly liberating for women and children, because men biologically are not tied to their sexual partners or the offspring from their sexual partners. Biologically, there is no binding of that. The only binding that comes is sort of societal and covenantal. And Jesus comes and he ties men to their women and to their children in bonds of love, and coming up through that kind of now, paradigm.
To some extent, again, I can imagine Bart may say, well, that was there in the Old Testament as well, Judaism. But I suppose the difference is, Glenn, that the fact it caught on in pagan culture is the fascinating thing, because if you want to just quickly sketch out the kind of rights, as you would say, a man had, in that culture sexually, that might help to give a sense of why this was so radical once it sort of expanded beyond Israel in that sense.
Right. Well, as Joseph Henrich points out, there were the 25 Latin words for prostitute, and there was no natural way in Latin to describe a male virgin. Right. That's just not a thing. Virgin means female. Right. Adult men were not expected to be virgins in any way. And there was a sexual economy that was based around prostitution and slavery, obviously, and it was not hidden away. It was part of the moral economy of society. And so for Jesus to bring about this kind of sexual revolution, it really was absolutely revolutionary, and it was part of Israel going global. And it was part of, Jesus is taking a side in Matthew 19 in terms of a debate about how easy should divorce be. And Jesus is like, no, it should not be easy at all. He takes the most sort of conservative, he kind of supercharges the conservative view. So not only does he take the Old Testament and supercharge it the same way he did back in Matthew 5, it then somehow bursts the banks of Israel and goes global to the nations. And I happen to think it's been for the blessing, especially of women and children.
What's your perspective on that? To what extent do you agree with his analysis of that?
Well, I don't agree with that one at all. I think that's completely wrong historically and ethically, personally. I think it's completely wrong. I think it's a Christianization of what actually happened. Jesus didn't invent monogamy. In the Jewish tradition of his day, men were monogamous. And so he didn't make up this. And he's not, in the passage in Matthew 19, the passage is not about whether you marry multiple people or not. It's about something else. And he's stating something that is taken for granted in his environment. Radical monogamy, to say that radical monogamy is good for women, I think is really blind to the social realities of our world. The big problem throughout the history of Christianity is that women were not seen as equal to men, and they were made to be submissive to men, and in every way, economically, sexually, socially. There's not a debate about this. I mean, look at how women are treated throughout the history of Christianity. I'm not talking about like the 1950s. I'm talking about the 50s and the 150s and the 350s and the 850s. Just look at the history. In early Christianity, the most liberating thing for women, as it turns out, was the ascetic movement. In Christian asceticism that started rising, especially in the 4th and 5th centuries, women who were highly religious and who were women of means were able then not to get married. And this was liberating for them because it meant they weren't under the control of their husbands. And so the church fathers encouraged rich women, not to get married because they knew that if they got married, then they were to be subject. And women didn't want that. And so I think it's completely wrong to say that monogamy, like where you cannot get a divorce, that isn't liberating for women who are being abused. And the reality is, I mean, whether they're Christian or not Christian, women back to domination. Women get dominated and abused sexually, physically, and there's no out now because you can't get a divorce. That doesn't sound liberating to me at all. And so I think that is, I don't think it's actually right. And I want to point out, a lot of Christians today, of course, typically want to emphasize that Jesus stressed these kinds of stressed family values. But going back to this conversation that Glenn mentioned earlier between Jesus and Peter, Jesus told his men disciples to leave their families to follow him. And Peter at one point says, Jesus tells this other guy, look, sell everything and follow me and you'll have riches in heaven. And Peter says, we've left everything. We left mother and father and children and wives and houses and to follow you. And Peter praises him because now they're going to get a hundredfold. These men will. What happened to their wives, do you think? Wives could not work outside the home, except by doing things that were very unpleasant to think about. Jesus had his men followers leave their wives. How are they supposed to survive exactly? These are lower class people who don't have day jobs now. They don't have jobs. They have no.
So men should be bound to their women then?
What's that?
So men should be bound to their women then, in very strong bonds. Like they shouldn't abandon their women then, right? Because that's bad for the women.
They shouldn't abandon them, no. But women, right. If women are being abused, if women are being beaten up, they should have the right to go back to their parents in that setting.
I agree.
Setting.
I 100% agree.
Well, okay, but that's
100% agree.
Jesus says you can't get a divorce.
Okay, let's have some response from Glen on this subject then. Go ahead, Glen.
Well, I mean, but in other contexts will, I'm sure, want us to compare Mark chapter 10 and Matthew chapter 19. And Matthew 19 is not the only thing that is said on divorce in the New Testament, let alone in the Gospels. But the other thing he also says in Matthew 19, which was picked up by the ascetic tradition, was that you can be a eunuch for the kingdom, which again is an amazingly supernatural thing because, of course, in the natural frame, how are you going to guarantee your future? How are you going to guarantee immortality beyond your death? Surely just through your offspring. That's kind of the only thing in the natural frame. And Jesus says there's something even better than marriage, which is singleness for the kingdom. And so Bart is absolutely right to pull me up on that and say the ascetic movement is even better. And Jesus even says that in Matthew chapter 19, that is even better. But in a world that Bart's just said is very, very difficult for women, especially if men abandon them, then surely it is better to have strong marriages in which men are commanded to and encouraged to stand by their women and stand by the children. And I would point people to Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, to show how that radical monogamy had incredible benefits. He is more of an evolutionary biologist and so sees everything in terms of survival and reproduction. But he traces every benefit we've ever had in the West basically to that marriage and family project, which I think is a bit narrow, but it certainly points to some of the goodness of monogamy.
Monogamy, of course, can be a very good thing. Of course it can. It can be a very bad thing. It's a mistake to say it originated with Jesus. It didn't start with Christianity. Monogamy was practiced widely in Jesus' world. But in other parts of the world, women could get a divorce if they were being abused. And so I don't see that it's a good thing to require them to stay in a marriage. And I don't think it's correct that this goes back to Christianity. Historically, it's not true.
So this is part of a wider discussion. So I begin the book with equality and starting in Genesis 1, because for me, the Old and New Testaments hang together. That might seem like an appropriation of Jewish, scriptures, but when I talk about Christianity, I don't simply mean something that began in the 1st century AD. I think Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. I think he is the Lord God of Israel come in the flesh. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I think you could, so I think the big thing about this is that women were not treated as people who needed to give consent within sexual relationships within Christianity. That didn't, throughout the history of Christianity, that is not how women were viewed in a marriage. The woman was to be submissive to the husband. It's in the Bible, of course, and it's in the Christian tradition.
And husbands were to be, yeah. Would you say that 1 Corinthians 7, for instance, is quite...
to the wives. They're supposed to be good to their wives.
The man's body belongs to the woman, just as the woman's body belongs to the man. I mean, that is radical for a first century author to say that the man's body belongs to the woman, just as the woman's body belongs to the man.
That verse is radical. Yeah, it means that if women want to have sex, their husband should let them have sex. Yeah, that is radical. But throughout the entire New Testament, men are to be over the woman. Just like, and Paul says, that the men are to the woman as God is to the man, or as Jesus is to the man, and as God is to Jesus. And so it's a hierarchy. And so it's not equality, and it does not require consent. Men who want to have sex throughout the history of Christianity. So you can't just say, well, since the 1960s it's been better, and that actually goes back to Jesus. You're skipping 1900 years here. And so Christianity has never supported the sexual equality of women within a marriage. Never.
But you just said the first century. Do you know of any other author that would actually speak in such bold terms about the sexual equality within a marriage as the Apostle Paul?
In its context, of course. Paul's talking about the situation where there are people in Corinth who think that the end is coming so soon that they shouldn't engage in sexual relationships. They should, because you should ignore all bodily pleasure, because Jesus is coming back very, very soon, and you don't want to have your head somewhere else. And Paul's simply saying, look, it is okay to have sexual pleasure if you're married already. And so, men, if you want sexual pleasure, yes. Women, allow
only if she wants to.
Women,
only if she wants to.
Yeah, that's right. So women, but it doesn't mean that women are not submissive to men. It just means if women want sex, men let them have sex.
Yeah, and vice versa.
Yes, vice versa.
Which is okay.
But the entire you can't say though that is what leads to the liberation of women in the modern period. It just isn't. I mean, it's not.
Okay, I'm not making exactly that argument, but I am making certainly the marriage and family program about marriage and the preference even for singleness is a radical way of ordering society.
Yes, but Jesus talked about singleness only for the men, eunuchs. He's talking about people who get castrated,
which is the radical thing.
Women. He doesn't say that women. Yeah. He's talking about men. Again, it's all about the men.
Right, because he's grabbing down. He's reaching down and grabbing men. Because it's men who are presumed to be the licentious ones. It's men who are presumed to be ones
they're in control.
Who could play away from home and do all the things that we know.
Jesus
that men
is not
do.
worried about women. He never says that women can be sexually ascetic.
But
That means women have to have sex. Only the men are allowed to become eunuchs.
Well, there are physiological reasons for why he uses that language.
What's the point? Why doesn't he say you women also? You also can abstain from marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't he say that?
Because the greatest need was to constrain male sexuality, which is precisely what Jesus does. Modesty for men meant something totally different from what modesty meant for women. For women, it meant virginity before marriage and chastity within marriage. But no, in the Roman world, modesty for men just meant not going to the prostitute too often, because that would open you to the charge of softness and effeminacy. Right? So total double standards. How do you attack the double standard?
Well, you're talking about a double standard.
You absolutely clamp down on men.
Okay. In early Christianity, in the New Testament, who is told to be modest? The women. Read 1 Peter. Women are to be subject to men and to be modest, because you have to put them where they belong. They're below us.
Count up the verses. Count up the verses, though, on those sorts of issues. It's men who are taught not to look with lust upon a woman.
Yes, exactly. And why is that? It's because adultery in Christianity meant that that you were taking somebody else's spouse. The woman was the man's property. You're not supposed to take your neighbor's property. The woman is not told about adultery because the man that she's having sex with is not somebody else's property. These are property laws. It's the same thing in the Old Testament. Coveting and when you're not supposed to covet in the Old Testament, You're not supposed to covet your neighbor's his house, his donkey, or his wife. Well, what does that say? The wife is right up there with the house and the donkey as property you're not supposed to want from the other person, and that's replicated in the New Testament. And so
in the
Go ahead, Glenn.
So in the Roman world, that was the case. In the pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures we're discussing, that was the case. Where do we get feminism from?
Well, you don't get feminism until the modern period. Feminism is a completely modern construction.
Yes, based on
people wanting to be liberated from standard morality that emerged from the Christian tradition of women having to be subject to men. Is this a debated point? Yeah. I mean, when you look at histories of feminism, I mean, just read histories of feminism. The problem is
not a liberation from immorality.
It's Christian mores that forced women to be submissive, and women rebelled.
Yes, on the basis of a vision for human equality, and I'm just asking where the basis is
From the
for that